So how can we use it? Well, as mentioned, I want to use it to make sure that when this button here is pressed, I load extra data and I display that extra data. And one way of making this happen is to add a special attribute to this button. Now that we added this HTMX import, it wouldn't work without that import. But with the HTMX library added, we can add special HX- attributes onto our HTML elements. And the official documentation, of course, lists all the attributes you can add, but will of course also dive into all those important attributes throughout this course, and I'll explain them in depth. So you don't need to learn about them here in the official docs manually. Now, one attribute we can add to an element, for example, is the HX-get attribute. And what this attribute will do is that it will send a GET request to a URL or to a path we define whenever it's triggered. And by default, this request will be triggered whenever the element on which you added it is clicked. So whenever this button is clicked, that's the default behavior of HTMX. You can change that, and I'll show you how you can change it, but that is the default behavior here. Therefore, here, in order to learn more data, we can send a GET request, and we set the path on the URL that's serving this page to which this request should be sent by adding an equal sign here, and then double quotes, just as we always assign attribute values in HTML. It's the same here. And between those double quotes, we now put the path to which the request should be sent. And here I want to send the request to /info, though you could specify any path here, because at the moment, this dummy Node.js application and server I provided to you doesn't support GET requests to /info. I got no handler for that anywhere in this app.js file, but we'll add one soon. So that will send such a GET request. How can we now handle it on the server? Well, in order to handle this GET request here to /info, we must make sure that our server has an appropriate route configured. And of course, you can not just use HTMX with Node.js. You could use it on any page that's served by any server that uses any server-side language of your choice. Of course, for example, also PHP, .NET, whatever you want. Here, it's a Node.js application though, specifically one that also uses Express, and I can register a second route, for example, by using my Express app object, and by calling get on it to register a new get route, and by then specifying the path for which I want to listen to GET requests, for example, /info. This would register a /info GET route on this backend server that's serving my site here. Now, we could also, by the way, specify a full URL to some other page here, if that page has that path and returns the data we need. But here I'm building an integrated application, and therefore it should be the same server that's serving this site here that's also returning the data we want here. Hence the extra route. Now, this route isn't done though. Here in Node Express, I also need to define a function that will be triggered when a request reaches that route. And that function will automatically receive a request and a response object. Express.js makes sure that this is happening. And we can use the response object to send back some data. And that's now the really important part when working with HTMX. The data that's returned by that backend must be in the right format for HTMX to understand and handle it. And the right format, the format HTMX expects, is not JSON as you would use it on many other web apps. So if you're building a backend for a React single-page application, for example, you would typically build a server that sends back JSON data, and then in the React app, you would use that JSON data to output some list items, for example. And that's not how it works when using HTMX. Instead, there, HTMX expects a response that contains HTML data. HTML content, not necessarily an entire page, but instead maybe also just a fragment of HTML code. But it does expect that. And therefore here I want to reply, so to say, by sending back a string that contains HTML code. So by sending back text that contains HTML code in the end. And the Express framework, which I'm using here, will then automatically detect that my response contains text that contains valid HTML code, and it will set an appropriate header on that response, which is then in turn telling HTMX that it's getting the data in the format it wants. So therefore here I want to return an unordered list. And in that unordered list, I want to return one list item per string element in this HTMX knowledge array. Now I'm already importing this array here into the app.js file, and therefore I can now easily generate one list item per element in that array by injecting a value into this dynamically constructed string. It's dynamically constructed by using this special backticks syntax that's supported by JavaScript. And here I'll use that array and then the map method. And then here I get one info text element per function execution. That's the way the built-in map method works. And I'll then return one list item per element in that array. And here in that list item, I'll simply wrap that info text. And that overall will generate an unordered list with multiple list items in it, one list item per element in this HTMX knowledge array. And that's then overall the HTML fragment I'm sending back from this /info get route. And that's then data in the format that is expected by HTMX. And thanks to this attribute here, this hxGet attribute, which we added, and thanks to the HTMX library, which we added, HTMX will now make sure that when we click on this button, a request to this route is sent, and then it will also make sure that it takes the response from that request, so that HTML code here, and outputs it. And by default, it outputs it in the place that triggered the request. But let's simply take a look at that in action. So I'll save that, reload this page, and if I now click Learn More, you see, boom, my list items are here, but there are a couple of problems with that code. Most importantly, the entire list was now rendered inside of that button. As you can also see if you inspect that in the developer tools. You can see this unordered list here was rendered between the button tags, and that's not really what I want. In addition, I also have this comma here between all those list items, and that's also something I want to fix. But the more important problem is that this list is rendered in the wrong place.